multiple marginalized identities. Today is a conversation about racialized ableism, which is a very difficult subject. And the reason why is because it's hard to talk about ableism on its own, and it's hard to talk about racism on its own. And so when you bring these things together, we're having an even bigger, difficult conversation. So this is kind of how I would love it to go, because I want to perhaps offer a conversation for folks who this is with questions that they may have. So I'm going to go over sort of some of the high level sort of pieces. And then as you are hearing this, I really encourage you to drop some questions in the Q&A box. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you should see two sort of talk bubbles that say Q&A. Putting questions in there, I will pause throughout and I will answer questions so that we can keep this as conversational as possible. Yeah, that's the thing. Also, leaning into discomfort is really important, as Sierra so rightly started us off with. It is a very difficult conversation. And so my hope is that, you know, this is the space to be brave and to have conversations and to think about things that perhaps you often wouldn't. So with that, I will get started after I take this drink of water. Okay, so there are four or five main overview topics that I'm going to talk about today. The first one is going to be sort of a general conversation about, really, if you ask me what it is they do in the work that I do, it's like, why humans human? And so we're going to talk a little bit about why humans human. Then we're going to talk a little bit about like disability justice versus rights. That's just, you know, something that people sometimes, you know, wonder, you know, they might use disability justice when they mean disability rights, or they may mean disability rights, but I think it's important to know what the difference is. Then we'll talk a little bit about what is, like, you know, what exactly is racism when we say racism, and then intersectionality. And then we'll get into racialized ableism, which will sort of bring everything together. And, oh, recreation access. We'll get to recreation access, yes. I see a question in the chat, and I think that'll be a good conversation, bringing in with racialized ableism to talk about the ADA and policies. Okay, so, first part, why are humans human? So the main way I got into this work, especially as an autistic person, is I think I came up into this world in talking about racialized ableism as well. I came up in this world as a Black, poor, autistic person of marginalized gender, and there's a lot of barriers put into the way of that, especially at the advent of the ADA. So when I was going into school, you know, I started going to school the same year as the ADA. And so as they were still trying to grapple with this policy and implement it in a way that was equal or equitable for all children with disabilities, which was its original plan, as we know, we're still sort of working through it, and we're still working through public education and really holding, you know, your IEP plans or your special education plans. Now, some 30 years later, when I was coming up in school, sort of at these intersections, it was a lot more difficult for everyone, but especially folks who are multiply marginalized. And so a lot of this interest that came to the sort of experience that a lot of us have is as you're, as we're coming up into this world, we are told, no, you're not doing this right. This is the way things are done. This is the way things are done. That kind of phrase is used in terms of well, at least my experience, how I talked, how I interacted with other children, how I ate my food, how I wore my clothes, how I played when I was playing, either individually or not, what colors I used to in my art time. All of these were things of, no, that's not the way it is. This is the way things are done. To a certain extent, sure, if you are trying to use an electronic device and instead of plugging it into an outlet, you're trying to plug it into a faucet, sure, that's not the way that things are done. But when it comes to the different sort of ways people are diverse and talking and interacting and moving in the world and understanding things, then starting to say, no, this is the way things are done, is how we condition or how we socialize people. And these are really big words to essentially say, this is how we tell people in every part of their understanding that don't do things the way you're doing it naturally, do things the way everyone else does it. This, at the core of this, is what they call a social construct. And it also is part of sociology. Sociology is essentially the study of what happens when you get a bunch of people together in one space and then they start doing things. And social construct is when you get a bunch of people together in one room and they start doing things, what are those sort of rules or norms or expectations and beliefs that come out of that grouping of people? And then a even more fun thing to sort of frame our discussion, what happens when those groups of people, because this is happening in little clusters all over the place. Yes, they even happen in little clusters in one room. In the before times, say if you had a networking event or a party you went to, in that same party of 100 people, you could have perhaps 2, 3, 4, 5 or more sociologies that developed at any given time. And so our society is constantly doing this. And it's important to understand that this is not a good thing and this is not a bad thing. This is a thing. It is a thing that we do as humans. Now, we as humans with certain sociologies, like being in a Western society or being in a society that that honors and centers things like perfectionism, or centers things like, even centers things like equity, which we'll get to, like what that means of centering equity. We do this too, but it shifts over time. So language and how we interact with each other, the ways that we see norms and beliefs, all of those different sorts of things are part of social construct and sociology. Sociology of knowledge is also super important. I'm going to give folks like a sort of a thing to think about. Think for yourself real quick, how many continents are there on the planet? You're going to say 7, right? 7 continents. And what's the definition of a continent? It's supposed to be a landmass that's surrounded by a body of water, right? So all 7 continents are supposed to be landmasses surrounded by a body of water. Is Europe surrounded by a body of water? So in this, what this is, and I shook my head no, it's not surrounded by a body of water. There are lakes and things like that, but that is not the definition of a continent. And so this is a sociology of knowledge. A sociology of knowledge doesn't necessarily have to be accurate. And this is also what happens when inequity comes in, is that we will all believe a thing because we've been told to believe a thing. We've been socialized to believe a thing. But that thing doesn't necessarily reflect either the reality of the situation, or it violates the validity and the assumption of another construct that we've created. Like, what is a continent? This, oh, okay, thank you. This is one of those situations where it's important to think about other aspects of our lives where we have been told, oh yeah, let's, you know, this is, you know, this is what it has to be. This is what it has to be. But, you know, when you really think about it, you're like, does it? So what I'm seeing is that we're going to have the interpreters switch out. So as they switch out, I want you to think a little bit about, when I say the word professionalism, what comes up in your mind, in your body? And if you're open to it, if you want to put in the chat what comes up in your mind when I say the word professionalism, and then we'll do that for like 30, 45 seconds. So I'm seeing some amazing responses in the chat. Some of them are respectful, behavior, dress, and boundaries, assertive, put together, polite. Number one was suit and heels. Number two was good posture and a set up straight, integrity. Sitting up straight in front of a desk. Behavioral expectations, organized. Professionalism equals what comes to my mind is perfection in job, no failure. Being responsible. Someone who is a good listener, wants to collaborate with others, allows feedback and constructive criticism, and accountability, respectful. Now I'm going to ask you all one of those really difficult questions again. When you were thinking about the person in the suit and heels, when you're thinking about the person being respectful or accountable, when you were thinking about the person sitting up straight at their desk, and if you were going to think about these different sort of constructs of how we classify folks in terms of the way they look in terms of race, the way they look in terms of their gender expression, the way that they look in terms of you know, class, or like, you know, whether they have money or a degree, what were some of the elements of that? Did it fall along a multicultural line, or did it fall along a line of someone who may have more privileged identities? The reason I asked this question is not to be it's not to be to go, what my spouse says, go straight to the quick. It is to sort of bring out this piece around the construct, and as some people said in a chat, they talked about privileged or a white cisgender male, which is not representative of themselves. This gets into a conversation around implicit bias, and the construction that leads to implicit bias, and how it happens in a way that isn't something that you're thinking about. So really quick before I go to the disability justice piece, because I really want to, set the stage for this, So, and as we're seeing in the chat, there's more people who are sharing, like people who fit into the mold, more privileged identities, like white, middle-aged women, man, white and Latin identities, multicultural socioeconomic standings, which I'm happy. Immediately, mostly privileged, white, skinny, cis women in business clothes. So here's the thing. A lot of us, when we're having these difficult conversations about equity and equality, the difference being, equality is that everyone gets the same resources allocated to them in the same way. And equity is that if we're trying to reach a universal goal where everyone is supposed to get to being at the same starting point, or at least are supposed to move forward in a way that elements of social error or social inequity. That means when we come together as a people and we make decisions, and then those decisions impact other people, regardless of how hard they work, regardless of how professional or, these other sort of constructs, right? How nice they are or how much they use their manners, but that we come together and we say, well, this equals this, and so therefore this should happen. It's important to think about that because those are the things that happen in our unconscious and subconscious and our superconscious. So when I'm talking, superconscious are those things that are so blatant and in our face that we just don't see them anymore. I know as a kid, I used to be super aware of cars. I used to have this thing, even if I was in the house, if I was too close to a roadway, the fact that the cars would pass me by, and sometimes you could feel the house sort of shake, sometimes you can hear the car horns, it would make me really anxious, and I would sometimes even have a meltdown. Now, because perhaps I'm masochistic, I live at the intersection of two highways. And so while I still get very startled, it's also, there's some times when I forget that I live at the intersection of two highways. And so now it's become a sort of super conscious thing. Same with my neighbors as well. Subconscious and unconscious are those parts of our brain, and I'm doing it back here because if I had a brain, that this would happen if you put your finger underneath of your chin and you put it right above your ear. This would be sort of where those processes in your brain that are thinking all the time and quick. It's milliseconds that we start thinking and taking action, and we need to do that because as humans we have been brought into a space where it's important to think on your feet. You don't have the time to sit and think about, oh well, should I in some cases we think about, like, should I eat today? Our body just naturally brings us towards the food. There are some elements, of course, where you start thinking about what you're thinking, but as you understand that there is some times when things just happen, and especially when you're in a state of high emotion. And so the same part of your brain that's constantly thinking all the time is also near part of your brain that has your fight, flight, or freeze response. And what that means is that if you say, look out your window and you see the Godzilla coming towards you, you're not going to sit there and think, is that a Godzilla? Did that just come out of Lake Washington? Where did that come from? No, you're zoom out the door. And then by the time you get to the last, to where you are, and really when your brain starts to think in this place where, okay, well, the Godzilla isn't going to come for me, that's when your conscious brain or your forebrain kicks in. That's the part where you start thinking about your thinking. Why did I do that? Why did I mean, of course you're going to know why you ran, but there's some elements of this that, and I will admit I've done it, where you get so mad and angry at someone that things just come spilling out of your body. And then it isn't until you get to a space where you actually can think about what you were thinking and you're like, why did I say that? Why did I do that? This is part of what it means to be human. So this is the reason why I spent so much time in framing this, because the rest of it from this hopefully can be a little bit more easy to understand. When we grow up in a society where part of the social construct or sociology of knowledge is that we are taking certain those classifications or those constructs that we've created, and we are applying it with reckless abandon, unconsciously or subconsciously, to an entire group of people. Now we have also added that into the way that we move about the world. And it has these ripple effects that we as individuals, and a lot of this is a whole different conversation about the Enlightenment period and Western ideology and thought and how we kind of see ourselves as the makers of our own destiny. And I think therefore I am sort of individualism. But the truth of the matter is that we're social creatures living in society. So even though we only sort of see ourselves at the center of our own constellation, we're still within one. And so it's important for us to be aware of how we are collectively creating situations for certain groups of people that we have classified and constructed as the opposite of identities that we laud as privileged identities. And what we also do as humans is we try to find a litmus or a sort of a archetype, or sort of this is what the epitome of professionalism is. This is what the epitome of manners is. This is what the epitome of success looks like. This is what the epitome of trustworthiness looks like. And unfortunately, a lot of those sort of ideas that sound abstract actually have, as we saw with the professionalism example, it has a what do they call that? There's a status quo to it, and the status quo is essentially like an expectation or a archetype or a characterization around it. So what I'll end with this is like how I kind of sort of understood this from my perspective is when I was younger, I grew up in South Jersey, Philadelphia area. So naturally I went to the mall a lot. And during, to date myself, during late 90s, early aughts, South Jersey mall culture in the age of My Chemical Romance and Muse, I also worked at Hot Topic because I was one of those kids. And so two things happened in this experience. The first one is, as I was a part of this subculture that in a lot of ways was supposed to be sort of for everyone who was sort of resonated with the goth culture, and the goth culture, I guess for my case, extending all the way back to like the Smiths and the New Wave movement. People would look at me when I was in there and they're like, I didn't know there was Black Gothic people. And it was really harmful because I'm like, really? I can't listen to Taking Back Sunday because I'm Black? Okay. But also even within, as Hot Topic employees, across the hall was Spencer's. Spencer's was a whole different sort of culture. And Hot Topic, Hot Topic is a space that it was sort of like AFI meets Avril Lavigne, and so the Avril Lavigne people, we were just like, no. So we started to construct sort of expectations and assumptions about them, which also impacted the way that we did our work. So if someone say came into Hot Topic with a Spencer's bag, we would acknowledge that we might give them worse service because we saw them as something else than they are. So I will pause there to see in the Q&A or in the chat if there are any questions or reflections about social constructs.
And so there was a few comments of, thank you for this clear explanation of how brain chemistry affects our interactions
I don't
with
think I can
life.
hear you. Oh, never mind. Sorry.
Hopefully you can hear me. Okay. And then another person from, where was it at? I can relate to all of this conscious behavior. And then there was that question that you acknowledged earlier of, can you speak to the intersection of race and disability when it comes to recreation access? And I think you said you're going to build to that. And then what was the question? Oh, the question in the beginning, they logged in late. And I guess that was what your vision is, I think, is what you were talking about, that of what do you imagine or think of, I guess.
Yeah, and so we're trying to think, like doing a exercise around like when you hear certain words, like what does it bring up? And so I spent so much time on this because I wanted to make sure that there was a foundational sort of conversation before we just jump into the constructs of it all, because everything after this point is going to be things that we as people came together and we decided this is what this thing means. And then people say, well, what does that really mean? And they say, well, that means that people like this can only do this, and people like this can only be here, and people like this do these things, and people like this bring this into our neighborhoods, and people like this act a certain way, and people like this should do this because then they could be more like this. And the last this is usually some sort of status quo that's based on a privileged understanding or identity or lens. And so everything from this moment sort of built off of that.
And just a reminder for anybody that is on that jumped in late, if you would like to join into the question answer portion, you can do that in the Q&A tab. If you'd like, we're trying to capture the stuff in the chat, but that way we make sure that we capture what your question is, your comment is, if you put it in the Q&A. Yeah. And we do have one person with their hand up. It's been up for a while now, so I'm not sure if you might have answered it. Let's see. I did just allow you to speak. I'm horrible with names, so I'm not even going to attempt it, but Dr. something. Did you still have a question? I saw your hand was still up. Oh, and there's a lot of...
Already answered.
Perfect. Thank you.
There is a Q&A that I'll address really quick. How do we undo social constructs of bias in the workplace? So at risk, who is this? Ron. Ron, at a risk of saying, oh my gosh, this is a whole conversation, because it is. And to be honest, there is people who make their entire living, whether it's as a consultant or whether it's as a professional in the workplace or whether it's as a researcher that studies this question. And so there's some of these questions that I think too, that I'll also put that I may or may not said is this sort of idea of social not idea, but social construct and people as sociology. This is something that we do. My mom always used to say there's things that people are and there's things that people do. And the idea around trying to reach parity or, equity is that, the things that people do is not always a reflection of who they are. And who a person is not always reflected in what they do. And so there is both a piece around accountability, personal accountability, and trying to keep those as shored together as possible. But there's also an aspect of this to remember that to err is human. But to understand that humans, as I lovingly say, are messy, we also can't allow the messiness of humans so much grace that people are harmed, that people are oppressed or marginalized or even killed. And so it's important to be aware of these things. So to your question, how do you address bias in the workplace? It's going to sound, because it's a difficult conversation, this is going to sound really simplistic, and I'm going to validate that it's not. The first thing to do is that people within an organization need to do a praxis, which it's like Praxis, a praxis of self-reflection and putting putting the self-reflection around what sort of gaps in understanding that they have, what their strategy towards equity is, into knowledge building, which is what we're doing right now. And taking the knowledge that you glean from this and sort of being able to reason backwards, which means that you're able to take that information, take risk into putting it into practice. But as you're doing that, you're able to do it from like, this is what's happening right now. What led up to this upstream? What is this leading to downstream? What people often do is they reason forward, or they what they call deduce. So that means that they'll say, well, XYZ things happened, so this must happen. But rarely are we in a space where we can say, oh, let's look at this from XYZ happening, and then this is going to happen. Often we kind of are in the middle of the thicket, and so we have to look up, and then we have to look down. Or we have to look back, and we have to look forward, however you see that. A praxis essentially just means it is a process. A lot of times it's seen as a triangle, and it's a process that you sort of go around in perpetuity, continuously, until you die. And so those are really the three: is knowledge sharing, and the sides are usually like risks. So knowledge sharing at the top, or knowledge building at the top, taking that knowledge and taking the risk of putting it into practice, which is that second angle. When you put it into practice, learning from your mistakes and successes, that's the one barrier here to self-reflection. And then when you get to self-reflection, having the courage and what they call intellectual humility to re-strategize, or to fill in gaps and understanding back to knowledge share. Intellectual humility essentially means that you are able to say, maybe I don't actually know what's going on. Maybe I do have more to learn. Maybe I really don't get this and I have to listen. And it's hard, really hard. Okay, and so as you do that, the reason why I say that is the main piece is because things like policies, workplaces, institutions, cultures, societies are all products of us, of people. I always say the biggest confounding variable to any equity initiative is people. If you don't address the people, it doesn't matter. It does matter, but it doesn't matter as much if all of the tools are constructed in an equitable way. Because as we talked about with the way that we move in the world with our unconscious or subconscious and our superconscious, and our conscious brain, if I didn't mention it before, is super slow. So when I say all these other processes are quick, it's our conscious brain is kind of slow. We're talking tens of seconds, if not hundreds of seconds, in our subconscious and unconscious brain. When, y'all have all done self-reflection and meditation. Maybe it might take you a couple seconds, maybe, but often it takes minutes, hours, days, weeks, months, years. I mean, I go to, to therapy, so there's a lot of times when we're thinking about our thinking that process takes a very, very long time. But that's not so much true in our subconscious brain. So being able to be aware and have a group of people instead come to that same sociology of knowledge that is leading with the equity that you like to see. Equity itself, yes, is an ideology or is a construct. Hey, if you go to one side of your city and you go to another side of your city and you ask people what equity looks like, you're going to get likely different answers. And so it's important to also be aware of that and be able to hold that, so that what Adrienne Marie Brown says in her book, in their book Emergent Strategy, that work will fractal out. It'll fractal out into your interpersonal relationships. It will fractal out into how you do your job. It will fractal out into the sort of policies and cultures that you create. It will fractal out into how we move about as actors in our society. So. That was a longer answer than I thought. Okay, getting to the next piece, because I spent a lot of time on this. But as you can see, there's a lot to talk about. So I want to get to disability justice versus disability rights. So disability rights essentially came first, and it, in a lot of ways, started centuries ago, with, depending on who you talk to, the construct of disability based on religion, the construct of disability based on capitalism and labor, the construct of disability based on the sort of mindset of eugenics. There's a lot of different sort of things, right? But where we really start to see the ADA story take hold is in the 70s, after the Civil Rights Act was passed. It wasn't so much that there weren't people in the civil rights movement that weren't disabled. It was just that the disabled folks were just not included in the Civil Rights Act. And so disabled folks started to move to fight for those civil rights as well. And in 1977, in Southern California, there was an occupation of over 100 people for over a month of people who occupied the Department of Health, the Education and Welfare Office. And these were all disabled folks who would refuse to leave until what we now have as the Section 504 of ADA was passed. And the reason I bring this up is because in that space, when we talk about racialized ableism, there's always a story of Bradley Lomax and his brother Glenn Lomax, where this black person who had MS, who was a wheelchair user, who came to that occupation of the building, and the Black Panthers themselves brought food, meals, and other sort of necessities to that occupation. What's important about this is that it shows one of the principles of disability justice, which is cross-disability solidarity, cross-movement solidarity. And, there's some things left to be talked about, right? Because as we march towards 1990, where the Civil Rights Act is passed, we have to consider the ways in which it was, which was primarily through legal and policy frameworks. Yes, there was some community organizing and some disruption, but it was still primarily through processes and avenues that, especially in the 1990s, as we are talking about the war on drugs, as we're talking about, people feeling sort of both sort of brought into or forced into reliance on social services while also being vilified for using social services at the same time. And it's sort of the advent of privatized prisons, the super predator narrative that came out of that movement from George Bush Sr. into Bill Clinton, and things like maximum sentencing and things like that. The rise of the prison industrial complex as we know it today. The ADA itself, as it became a policy, in a lot of ways similar to the Civil Rights Act, is a policy. And so then once you have it written, people have to then take it and they read it and they are interpreting it, not necessarily always with their conscious brain, also with their unconscious and subconscious brain. And then they go and they talk to people and they process it. And then that becomes the super conscious, where they all come together and say, oh, well, I think this is what it means and for whom it means and how we're going to do it. And they implement it in that way. And so this is, again, not supposed to be a good thing or a bad thing. It's a human thing. Where the inequity comes in is then the impacts, and then not doing what is needed to re-strategize or fill in gaps in understanding to disrupt and end those impacts that are negative on people. We then go back to the individualization we were talking about, where we then say to the person, it's your fault. It works for me. If it doesn't work for you, it must be something that you're doing. But as we have already heard about things like systemic racism, systemic ableism, systemic sexism, systemic classism. We've heard these things about systemic, and what that means is that such a large number of people have came into that sociology of knowledge and made those constructs, and then some of those people are in positions of power where they create the policies, where they fund the resources, where they make the decisions, where it just becomes ingrained and infused insidiously into the fabric of our society and our conditioning. And so in this, all of this was happening at once. And so in 2004, I think it's 2004, there was a reconsideration of the ADA, and they did expand the definition of disability a little bit more broadly and add some other things, but there were still people missing. There was especially people with psychiatric disabilities, people with developmental disabilities as well being sort of seen. It also, unfortunately, came around the same time as George Bush Jr.'s No Child Left Behind, which was extremely detrimental to the public education system along multiple lines. So there was a group of Black and brown, queer, disabled folks who came together and was like, there are some things that need to be addressed. And so they came up with an emerging framework called disability justice. A framework is different than a policy. It's kind of the difference between Black Lives Matter to Civil Rights Act. Disability justice is sort of this to the ADA. Just like Black Lives Matter to the Civil Rights Act is saying there's this policy, but this policy is falling short in these areas. And we as a society need to consider these gaps and these disparities so we can bring parity to it, or equity. Similarly, disability justice is saying this about the ADA. And so there are 10 principles of disability justice. And I wrote them down because I can't remember them off the top of my head. It is intersectionality, leadership of those most impacted, anti-capitalist politic, commitment to cross-movement organizing, recognizing wholeness, sustainability, committed to cross-disability solidarity, interdependence, collective access, and collective liberation. To explain some of these, intersectionality is a term that was created in the 80s by a legal scholar named Kimberly Crenshaw. Kimberly Crenshaw was a Black woman, identified as a woman, who was studying why other Black women were not able to get jobs in certain spaces, and in her particular case, in an automobile manufacturing company. She went to the company and said, why aren't you hiring Black women? And they said, oh, what we do, because we hire Black folks and we hire women, so it must be something that they're doing. So when Kimberly Crenshaw went to look, they did hire Black folks, but they primarily hired Black men to do back of the house line work. And they did hire women, but they primarily hired white women to do front of the house administrative work. Because of the intersectional constructs of this, the Black women were not being put in the manufacturing jobs because of sexism or misogyny, and the Black women were being put in the front of the house because of anti-Blackness and racism. So this intersectionality came as a way to describe what happens when these two identities, in particular Black women, are two identities that are marginalized, oppressed, or exploited, come together to have a compound effect of being impacted by inequity. So with intersectionality, this is sort of where racialized ableism comes in. Intersectionality is talking about the compounded impact of experiencing ableism and experiencing racism. Racism and anti-Blackness are very much connected, but not the same thing. Race is a construct that was created in Spain some 600 years ago. And it was originally based around conversion of Jewish people in Spain to Christianity. as the Spaniards required the Jewish people in a very anti-Semitic way to convert to Christianity, they started to then construct beliefs about this group of new converts. In a lot of ways, they said these new converts were going and praying at the synagogue behind their backs, and they're trying to take over the politics, and a lot of the same anti-Semitism that we hear today. So then they started to put parameters around what they can and cannot do. Like, well, these people are a whole new group of people, so they can't own property, they can't run for office, they can't bank with us, you can only have certain jobs. The Spaniards, or people from Spain at the time, were also instrumental in the quote unquote exploration or westward expansion of Christopher Columbus to what is now modern day Puerto Rico and Dominican Republic, what he called Hispaniola. And so as he started to go there, race, in addition to at the same time anthropology as a study becoming a thing, anthropologists going into Africa as a continent and creating their own interpretations of what that means. Starting to take artifacts. If you want to look up something and you're kind of into the gross, you can look up how the European anthropologists would go into Egypt, and there was sort of this obsession with Egypt. They used to take mummies and sell them for consumption. They saw mummies as magical, and it's one of the reasons why we don't have as many today. And we started the transatlantic slave trade of chattel slavery, which is the difference between chattel slavery and the slavery we traditionally think of, like indentured servitude, is that chattel slavery is not only lifelong, but it is then becomes a birthright. In the United States, one of the instrumental laws towards racism here and anti-Blackness was that they started they created a law, I believe in the 16 or 1700s, where if you are an enslaved person, particularly an enslaved woman, all of your children would have the same status as you, which means when you are born into slavery, and there is no end. So this is sort of the foundation of where that comes from. Anti-capitalist politics essentially is talking about not classifying people based on their labor, not classifying people based on their productivity, and paying them wages that are fair and equal, if not equitable. One of the things that people don't know, but some people do, that continues to this day is some minimum wage. Some minimum wage is a certificate that organizations can apply to. It's protected by the Fair Labor and Standards Act that can give a company the right to, or at least give them the pass, to pay people beneath minimum wage. And when I say beneath minimum wage, sometimes I'm talking about pennies on the dollar. The issue with this is that when people have fought for this, of course, there are some people who, because of other systemic issues like having SSI or SSDI, where you can only make a certain number of a certain amount of money per month without having a ding to your benefits. But there's, the counter argument to that, right? Where it's like, well, maybe we should just not have a cap on that, and if people make more, then they make more, and if people don't, then they don't. But also the issue of that is then when people fight against the minimum wage, as I did here in Seattle, in King County, alongside my co-chair with Seattle Disabilities Commission, or former co-chair of Seattle Disabilities Commission. The biggest argument is, well, we don't know if the investment of a full minimum wage, let alone a living wage, is possible for us to be able to really to really get down with that. So it's a difficult piece. The other thing that I wanted to just share too is interdependence is essentially meaning that we're in society with each other. And recognizing wholeness means that no one is broken. We don't see people from a deficit model. We see that everyone has strengths and everyone has something that they can give to the world. And so it's important to think about disability justice and disability rights in this way as I talk about like what's happening right now with Black Lives Matter and anti-Blackness. As it was said in the introduction, my grandmother was a Black Panther, and I've heard stories, not just from her, but from people in my family around what it meant to be in that life. And everything from being harmed themselves to seeing other people being harmed. Again, my family is from South Jersey, Philadelphia area, so my mom was there and impacted by the movement. Even though my family did not live in that collective, they were Black people in that general area, and so they were just looped into that entire piece. And my mom was, as well as some of my uncles and aunts, were harmed because of that. And so when people hear Black Lives Matter, especially in intergenerational organizing with my elders, are like, well, what exactly are people asking that hasn't, been asked before? Or what exactly are these kids doing that, always use kids as this thing. What exactly are these kids doing that we didn't do? Well, in a lot of ways, not a lot different. But what it is saying is that we have been talking about this for a while, and there continues to be inequities, and so it's important that we hold these. The other thing about anti-Blackness that's important is that while it's rooted and disproportionately impacts people of the African diaspora, diaspora means people whose original ethnic heritage and nationality is from the continent of Africa, but they're living across the world, a lot of it because of the slave trades, not just the transatlantic slave trade to the west, but the slave trades to the east as well. What this means is that what then becomes colorism is also an issue. Colorism or shadeism is when you look at the way someone's skin tone is, and the deeper their skin tone is, or more melanated their skin tone is, the more that they face harm, marginalization, or oppression. And the lighter their skin tone is, the less that they do. And of course, this isn't an exact science, but sort of where we see the smoking gun of this is in a multi-trillion-dollar industry across multiple parts of the world of skin whitening and bleaching treatments and hair smoothing treatments and plastic surgery so your face can look more aquiline. As we talked about, like these sort of standards of respectability and politeness that in some cases is not necessarily inherent to someone's culture. And all of these things come into a colorism that kind of leads back to our thought experiment about professionalism earlier. And so to end with that piece, there is a piece there around like the natural hair discrimination ban, where in some states there has been laws passed that employers cannot dismiss someone from a job or from school based on the way their hair naturally grows out of their head. And you may think, oh yeah, sure. But this argument has been brought to the Supreme Court several times of the United States. And the Supreme Court of the United States has consistently ruled that hair texture is not an immutable characteristic, which essentially means because you can chemically straighten your hair, because you can put something on like a wig, then they will not see it as something that needs to be protected under the Civil Rights Act or Discrimination Act because you can change it. It's super violent because, again, another conversation around the impacts of non-natural ethnic hair care and the sort of chemical burns that comes out of the processing of that, as well as the increased labor and time that goes into it. So with racialized ableism, and then I'm going to go to just like a pure sort of question answer period, unless there's something else, is looking at the compounded impacts of this. And so I'll talk about 3 different spaces. The medical racialized ableism is essentially the intersection of being both disabled and Black, and going and seeking healthcare. This can be an issue, especially with things like the pandemic. We had our own Surgeon General sort of call out Black and Brown communities and say that perhaps they wouldn't contract the virus as often if they stopped drinking and doing drugs. That's what he said. If you want to look it up, that's what he said on television for everyone to hear. And so it's also, again, making that sort of conditioning. There are some statistics that are really sobering about the impacts of just what it means to be a person of color, but especially a person with a disability. To say Black women in general has a maternal death rate that's 3 to 4 times higher than a person who is not a Black person, specifically a white woman, a white birthing person. Um, and that number, depending on what you look at, either goes up when that Black birthing person has a disability, or down because the Black birthing person with a disability has a higher rate before going through the neonatal process and delivery process of essentially being asked to terminate the pregnancy or to self-sterilize themselves. There has also been, up until even now, where people have been sterilized without their knowledge through the medical system. And this could be anything from sort of have, there's some really terrible stories, especially from like the 90s. In North Carolina in particular, I think, had a hospital where, people would go in for surgery and then they'd be like, how come I can't have a baby? And they'll realize that their tubes were tied or something was missing. All the way up to like, hey, we think that you should put this IUD in. And there has been some cases where people have had IUDs put in for other sort of procedures that they didn't ask for. Also, I have a disability called POTS. It stands for postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. What that means is if I sit up or I stand up too fast or I stand for too long or I walk for too long, then my body starts to go into sort of tachycardia symptoms, which is a whole other conversation. Black marginalized genders, again, the Black people in general, are again, I think in this case, 2-3 times more likely to die of a heart attack in the ER than anyone else. And a lot of it is because even now in medical school, they teach that certain people have different sensations of pain. Certain people have different sensitivity to their nerve endings, and that Black folks both don't feel pain as strongly, which is more generous than it had been in the mid 20th century and earlier, where they didn't believe that Black folks felt pain at all. And that the pain that they feel is going to be more along the lines of psychosomatic or hypochondria than for it to be true pain. So they prescribe pain medicine at a lower rate and provide pain interventions at a lower rate based on, again, these constructs. The second thing I want to talk about is public education to get to your conversation. So there's a lot of these sort of conversations, like the Discrit book. I also will just realize in my introduction, I will send out a resource list with some of these terms and some resources of people to follow, articles, books, videos, so y'all can continue to do this work on your own. But Discrit is a book that talks about the intersections of this specifically, but the school to prison pipeline is definitely a conversation that we all kind of have heard, and essentially it talks about how through that systemic piece around the subconscious and unconscious biases towards Black and Brown students, and sort of how they sort of get ranched into a prison system. There's also a school to institutionalization pipeline where if it's not criminalization, it's pathologizing. And so Black and Brown students, if they're not seen as criminals, they're seen as having some sort of emotional or psychiatric disability, which then also sort of railroads them into institutionalization. That was my experience. That was the experience of several people that I worked with as a sort of peer counselor and social worker. And it's very insidious. And it's difficult because when you're a child or a teenager, first of all, you are going through a natural process of regulating your emotions. When you have additional stressors, especially stressors based on social construct, it's going to also interfere with that development. And to then pathologize people for going through a natural state of human development, and instead of sort of creating a safe space for us children and teens and young adults to sort of grapple through, process, and digest what's happening around them, we pathologize them and then we put them into institutions. And so so this is also something that we have seen. And finally, environmental racism, and then I will get to the Q&A. Environmental racism is something that we are seeing a lot with the pandemic, but it's not new. We've heard about Flint, Michigan, and how Flint, Michigan, I think to this day, still doesn't have any clean water. And it's been like 7 years. Environmental racism is when we as a society do certain things that disproportionately harms Black and brown neighborhoods and communities, of which we as a society also create through things like redlining and discrimination in leasing, mortgage lending, and real estate. But then we also put we also put additional obstacles in their way and specifically impact social determinants of health. One of those things, what they call administrative racism or violence, is they will, city planners, when say they build a manufacturing plant or they build a highway, that they have to consider the runoff of exhaust and pollutants. And so they'll create this thing called a sacrifice zone. A sacrifice zone is where they're going to place this so that the runoff and pollutants go into a certain direction. There is a high instance of those certain directions being over Black and brown neighborhoods. And so similar to what I'm experiencing right now in Seattle with the wildfire smoke, and everyone is stuck in their house with air purifiers and HEPA filters on their box fans and they're trying to breathe, people have to go through this every day. So my family and a lot of the other families that live in Camden, New Jersey, Philadelphia, Brooklyn, all these different sort of places, all these other sort of places, and there's other places. I'm from the East Coast, I'm always thinking these places. Children and people have high instances of things like lung cancer or respiratory failure. If they're drinking it, it could be liver or cirrhosis. It could be indigestion issues based on the corrosiveness of the things going into their body. It could be a whole host of things. It could be like lead poisoning, as we see with Flint, Michigan. Now we have a whole generation of children and people with lead poisoning. And so, it's thinking about when those children grow up, to what extent are they going to be held accountable to their own lead poisoning that came from a reluctance or refusal, really, to provide clean water to Flint, Michigan. There is a place in Brooklyn called Asthma Alley, and they have 21 times the hospitalization rate traditionally for people being hospitalized with asthma in the country. In the boroughs, and 7 times in the country. So they're also particularly hard hit by the pandemic, which is a respiratory virus. And so the reason why they're called asthma alley is because they're in so many different sacrifice zones of pollutants. It's one of the highest polluted areas in the country. And so when you have people who are in sort of redlined Black and brown neighborhoods that are in a sacrifice zone, that have respiratory illness due to higher instances of pollutants, and then a respiratory pandemic comes through, what do you think is going to happen? So then to go to that group of people and to say, oh, it's your fault, racialized ableism. So I will leave it at that. There's a lot that I could talk about, but I do want to get to these questions. And so I'll start. answering them. And please put anything that you want to ask or anything in the chat. So going back to Chris, can you speak to the intersection of race and disability when it comes to recreation access? So the reason why I wanted to share this is because the ADA is the whole point of the ADA is that it's supposed to provide equity and equitable access, at least equal access to any sort of public funded good. Even the EPA, at least it used to, had an aspect of the ADA in the EPA's policy because it is important to have access to recreation. But where disability justice comes in is like, yes, that's what the policy says. And that's what we're supposed to do in the legal framework. But is it happening? No. Not consistently, and not to a place where we can really say, okay, we got it. So the difficulty with that is the argument has to go beyond the ADA, right? I mean, either we have to really hold access to spaces of recreation to account with the ADA, and to a certain degree we can, in terms of things like curb cuts and ramps and things like that. But there are also, you know, just because it's the law doesn't necessarily mean people will implement it. So there's also a piece of this too, where going outside as a person of color, as a Black, brown person, at all is an undertaking. And so when I first went out to the playground, I was told, I think about 3 or 4, and I was told by my mom, because we lived in social housing, so there was a lot of police around, that when I saw a police officer, I am to sit on the ground, spread eagle, sitting up with my hands above my head, and say, my name is Christiana, and I'm this years old, and this is where my address is, and I'm outside playing. I was 3 or 4 years old. So there's also a piece of this where intergenerationally, even now as I am in the space as a birthing person and doing family planning, where people in my family are coming in and like, make sure that you don't just send them to the playground on their own, and maybe y'all could find a way to have a private space for them to play so they don't have to go to the park. And it's really sad and hard to hear that, but that's also not a it's not specific to me, it's not specific to Washington. It's a conversation happening across the country. So I think with recreation access, there is a piece around disability justice and bringing disability justice into the disability rights conversation and bringing them together to ask for equity in addition to equality. The issue with equality, really quick to talk about it, is like, for example, when we got the stimulus checks for $1,200, everyone got the stimulus check for $1,200, up to, I think, $79,000 a year, I think, is how much you can make as an individual. So if you are someone on SSI, say, and you get $7,900 a year, and you are someone who makes $79,000 a year, and they both get $1,200, it's easy to see how that $1,200 is going to have a way bigger impact and weight for someone who makes $7,900 versus $79,000. And this is the difficulty with equality models and not equity models, which would say this person with $79,000 may or may not need all the $1,200. The person with $7,900 may or may not need $1,200 or more dollars. And how can we make sure that everyone is going to be able to do what the stimulus check, I guess, was meant to do, which make sure people had shelter, food, and personal protection equipment. So equity and disability justice would be my suggestion for recreation access. How can we undo the school to prison pipeline amongst students of color, especially the students of color with disabilities? The school to prison pipeline disproportionately affects. Like I said, that's a big question. I will post in the chat what I'm saying. But Discrit is a book that is specifically talking about this. It came from a research project specifically looking at the intersections of this. And I think it's I will send you to that resource, but essentially it's similar to the answer I gave earlier. To undo the school to prison pipeline, there is a lot of work that we intrapersonally, the way that I and myself, or you and yourself, sort of have an interactive sort of movement through the world and lived experience understanding, and the interpersonal, so how this happens between two people or more. And we have a lot of work to do in that space before we can undo anything that's systemic, or is rooted and insidiously rooted through our policies or institutions. I know it sounds like a big answer that sounds really big and nebulous, and it is. It is a big nebulous answer. But we as a, if you think through the history of it, we've done a lot of things to address inequity in our society, but the one thing that we have sort of consistently wanted to push away has been doing this really deep, self-reflective audit work, and taking sort of accountability, community accountability and personal accountability for the perpetuation and impact of this. Let me put it this way: Civil Rights Act, if it was to matter at all, if Martin Luther King and Malcolm X was to matter at all, the Civil Rights Movement was to matter at all, 56 years ago, 1964, 56 years ago. If it was a person, it wouldn't even qualify for retirement. It is within living memory. This isn't old history. This is now. And so even if we want to say, okay, everything pre-Martin Luther King, let's get rid of it. 56 years. That means if you're over the age of 56, there may be a high likelihood that you remember what it's like to be brought up in a society pre-civil rights. And especially if you get to like 60s, mid to late 60s, mid to late 70s, you may have been brought up in your childhood development and socialization in a pre-civil rights era. It's important to think about how we are all complicit in this, because it's within living memory. And I think that sort of historical mindset, not even historical, contemporary mindset, in understanding is not really something that we think about a lot. And this is especially to facilitate a more successful transition from high school to post-secondary life. A lot of that too is opportunities for students, BIPOC students, especially BIPOC students with disabilities, to have the opportunity to I think it goes all the way down to being given stretch assignments, being held as a scholastic and academic equal, or to actually have an expectation within the faculty and the staff of schools to have Black and Brown disabled students in a position to be able to go into that post-secondary life. When I was coming up, I would look at the Running Start, I would look at the honors programs, I would look at those places where they were preparing you for college, and there wasn't very many of any of the students who look like me. There were some students in there with disabilities, but there weren't a lot of students of color with disabilities. And so it goes back to that conversation around what is happening in the interpretation, implementation of our public education system, preparing students for post-secondary education, that it continues to disproportionately impact Black and Brown students at the intersection. So I do really recommend that Discrit book, because it really goes down to the nitty-gritty of that. Someone says, how much did the DARE program have to do with the war on drugs program you're discussing? I heard research well after the 90s indicating that the drug educational DARE program was not successful for partly the reasons you described. I'm just going to say this really quick. The reason why I had to take a breath is because it's a personal impact. So remember I was talking about the school to institutionalization pipeline. I said I was multiply disabled. I've been autistic my entire life. I also developed a psychiatric disability in my high school years, which is when that happens. And so, you know, I was originally going to school to be a counselor. And so I learned that, you know, mid-teens, early 20s is sort of the time when those things develop. And so there are ways to hold a student as they are going to the onset of psychiatric disability. However, being at my intersection in a primarily white school, I was not seen as someone who had a psychiatric disability or onset of one. I was seen as someone who was on drugs. And so the DARE program, oh, 5 minutes, yes. The DARE program was instrumental in that, in my institutionalization, in that they would have a DARE officer in the school. The DARE officer could pull you out of class at any time. The DARE officer had a car, which is essentially a police car with some graffiti paint sprayed on the side because it looks cool. And they would take you to be tox screened. And if the tox screen didn't come back positive, then they would start talking about whether or not you needed to have an involuntary commitment, and that can lead to a cascade of situations. The DARE program was really focused too on gang violence, which then if you look at what gang violence is being portrayed as, especially in the 90s and early 2000s, it was disproportionately Black and brown folks, Black and Latinx to be exact. And so again, going back to what we did with the thought experiment around professionalism, if your understanding of your construct, your subconscious, unconscious, superconscious construct of what it means to be in a gang, to do drugs, to be drug dependent, all these things are crowded around the super predator idea of Black and Latinx people sort of going out and doing these things, then that's where you're going to focus your attention. So it goes back to we have to really see how the actors in these systems and the creators of these policies and the sustainers of these institutions are what's going on with that. We have 4 minutes, and I know that Mel's going to answer some questions. This will be really quick. Last question I see on here. How can we support someone who's being denied pain medication from a doctor? Is there a way to prove suspected racism from a doctor who won't prescribe medicine? He may suspect it maybe because she's Black. I have been decrying the beauty of possibly having cultural brokers. Cultural broker is a program that's more popular in places like Canada and England, and it is a person who could be a peer counselor all the way up to a social worker that it also shares the identities, lived experiences, and intersections of a person who's going into a doctor's office. They also are well versed in what it means to be in the medical field, and so that person could go in, they could talk to the patient or the client or however they're being regarded, and say what is it that you are trying to have achieved in this meeting. They come into the meeting, of course, with the consent of the patient or client, and they sort of broker a conversation. They disrupt doctors if they are starting to go down a recommendation pathway that is anti-Black or ableist or both. And they also can serve as sort of a whistleblower, or not even a whistleblower, but sort of an accountability person, so that they are also seeing some of those systemic issues throughout the clinic or the hospital or the practice. Until we have this like around, I think this self-empowerment and amplification of the voice of the person that you're supporting. I think having conversations, not being a voice for the voiceless, because that's not needed, but being an ally or co-conspirator with this person, and amplifying and reiterating the asks of that person to the hospital, and to hold them accountable to harm. I think it's more than fair. When I was doing social work, with the consent of my clients, I would call doctors. Of course, we had to fill out the form, the consent form, and all those sort of things. There's HIPAA, but you know, I would call them and be like, I just want to ask some questions about what I'm seeing in terms of the treatment of my patient or my client. I would like to ask, like, what is the protocol for pain management? Have you had other clients with this sort of presentation of pain? Have you given them the same sort of treatment options, or is there something different with my particular client? And sometimes they won't answer it, but it is something that more cases than not, my client, at least for a little bit, the doctor would change their tune a bit. So again, I think it's one of those systemic issues. In medicine, we have another talk. We'd have a whole conversation about the history of racialized ableism in medicine. But we march forward together, and we have little wins at a time. Okay, one last minute. Yeah, those are all the questions.
I think that was it. Did anybody else have one? I don't see anybody's hand raised. I didn't see any in the chat. Um, I am dropping in. If you all would just take a minute to fill out, it's like 5 questions. It's super easy. But I just want to know what the feel is of the conversation today. I'm already getting emails from people going, how can we continue this conversation? Which makes me very happy because that's what it's going to take, is continuing the conversation. Let's see. I do have, all right. Go ahead, Arius. You should be, just unmute and you should be good.
Good morning, good afternoon to wherever you are. It's a great presentation so far, but one of the questions I have is, we talked about the social constructs and you know, just kind of about, and you talked about when you said finding a voice for the voiceless, that's not needed. Can you talk about some of the ways that we can do that without it being so blatant, or to where people just say are dismissive of that when it is needed?
So, how to put this? There's inequities that we witness just because we're in community with someone. And we can speak to where we are standing, either as a professional, as a person, as a friend, as a community member, as a family member, as to the inequities that we're seeing. And we can share that. And so there's a difference between, but there is a lived experience, there is a narrative, there is a voice, there is a story that people can, that should be amplified, because if it's surrounding this person, that person has a story. One of the things I didn't share is that I was started late, but I was started in ABA around 17. Up until I was about 12 or 13, I was predominantly nonverbal. I still, when I'm not masking, as I am right now, nonverbal. If I don't have to be, I won't. In my relationship with my husband, I use an AAC device primarily, as well as with my mom. There are still ways to see what it is that I'm trying to say in terms of my lived experience of inequity. While it may not necessarily be as articulate as someone who can say that, it's still there, and we can amplify that. And most of our communication is nonverbal as a society, or at least it's supposed to be. And so I think that there is a space here where we as a society should know when we are harming someone. Us sharing how we are seeing a person being harmed, or a group of people being harmed, or the impact of harm as someone who loves and cares for this person, is not the same as speaking for them. You can be amplifying the situation. You could be sharing your own personal frustration. You can be advocating on behalf of a larger systemic issue. But where there is this sort of threat is when we start speaking for someone, especially if it's because they are not able to, lay it out in words the way that we'd like them to. But we can still amplify what it is that they're communicating. Communication doesn't have to require words or language. So I would just, for brevity, I would just say it's not saying you can't speak up. It's not saying that you can't amplify. It's not saying that you can't advocate, but it is saying don't, what I call, be an Ursula ally. Don't take someone's voice and then use their voice on behalf of them. Like Ursula in Little Mermaid, but trying to amplify and to bring more attention and centering of this person, and sort of bringing in those through lines of what this person is going through with the systemic or institutional impacts that it's having the the community that you're discussing.
Thank you for that. And I see so much great comments. Thanks so much. Great topics, great presentation. Thank you. So, Christiana, I just want to thank you. This was great. For anybody that is still on, we do have a Youth Coordinators Connect that will be happening towards the end of this month. Please look out for that, specifically as a more open conversation as well. But I thank you for joining us. This is always great information, and I could literally listen to you talk for hours, which I'm sure it's not fun. But thank you all. I hope you enjoyed it. Again, if you'll just take a minute or so to fill out evaluation, that helps us at April know where we want to continue with this conversation and what you still want to know or learn, so we can keep hopefully trying to meet that need as you would like. Thank you again for the interpreters and the captioning, and Mel's and Arius for all helping put this together. So thank y'all. Y'all have a good day. And yep, I am going to send it through an email as well. So I'll do a follow-up email with that. Thanks, Alan.